In today's fascinating episode, we're going to talk about two of the most unlikely rulers you've probably never heard of, Aleksandr Kolchak and Miklós Horthy. From opposite sides of World War I, they both have a surprising thing in common. Stay tuned for more on this story. Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Me, Myself, and I History, where weird history and strange happenings in the universe are always on the menu. My name is Seraphim. Aleksandr Vasilievich Kolchak was born on the 4th of November 1874 to an artillery officer of the Russian Imperial Navy, Vasily Kolchak. As the son of a naval officer, he was entitled to attend the Naval Cadet Corps, after which he would go on to a distinguished career as an oceanographer and polar explorer for the Russian Imperial Navy. He was either a participant or a leader in multiple Arctic expeditions during his service. His service would lead him to being the youngest vice admiral in the history of the Russian Navy. The Imperial Russian government had only one naval base on its far east coast at Vladivostok, which was ice-free only a few months a year due to its far northern location. Seeking a naval and trade base that was free of ice year-round, they leased what came to be called Port Arthur, modern-day Lushankau, in China, from the Qing dynasty in 1897. Russia had pursued an expansionist policy east of the Urals since the time of Ivan IV Grozny, better known to English speakers as Ivan the Terrible. This expansionist policy was seen as an encroachment on the sphere of influence in Manchuria and Korea that Japan had planned since the successful 1895 First Sino-Japanese War. When negotiations between Russia and China broke down over who would control what parts of that sphere of influence in Manchuria and Korea, Japan made a surprise attack on 9 February of 1904, opening the Russo-Japanese War. Kolchak was wounded in the attack and was taken prisoner. After he was released, he urged the Russian State Duma to strengthen the naval assets in Russia. They did so, and he later became the Baltic Fleet Chief of Operations, a position which he held until hostilities broke out in World War I. Shortly before the 1917 February Revolution, Kolchak was made commander of the Black Sea Fleet. When Tsar Nikolai II Romanov asked each of his commanders about whether he should abdicate, Admiral Kolchak was the sole voice saying that he should not abdicate. Kolchak was invited to the U.S. as a quasi-official advisor, but the journey proved to be moot because Kolchak's knowledge of the situation in the Dardanelles was no longer needed. Eventually, he wound up in Japan and entered the British Embassy and offered his services in any capacity whatever. He soon found himself in Omsk via China with the aim of overthrowing the Bolsheviks and helping the British in getting Russia back into the war with Germany. In late September 1918, Admiral Kolchak was made the Minister of War and Navy of the Provisional All-Russian Government, also known as the Directory or the UFA Directory. The Provisional All-Russian Government was the anti-communist government formed in response to the rise of the Bolshevik All-Russian Congress of Soviets which had come to power. About 3 months later, a coup overthrew the Directory government, and all power was transferred to Admiral Kolchak as supreme ruler of the White Forces. In late 1918 and early 1919, Kolchak's forces saw early success, but quickly lost ground due to a lack of both local and international support and infighting among the white leadership. It was in this time that Kolchak wrote a letter to his wife, who was in Paris, about his dislike of politics. He wrote that he knew nothing of statecraft and that he regarded it as a cross to bear. He was a military man through and through. When American and British support fell through and the Japanese withheld all support, things began to collapse for the white movement, even as the Red Army was uniting and growing stronger. By October or November of 1919, the Reds had driven Kolchak's increasingly disorganized army back to Omsk. The Whites began fleeing to Irkutsk along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Soon, Kolchak's train had been sidetracked before reaching Irkutsk, which had been taken over by a coalition of left socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. Kolchak was compelled to resign as supreme leader by the Czechoslovak Legion. He was promised safe passage to the British mission in Irkutsk. Instead, he was betrayed and handed over to the left socialist revolutionaries, and a few days later they surrendered power to the Bolsheviks. For several days, Kolchak was interrogated. Despite orders from Moscow ordering Kolchak shipped east, presumably for a kangaroo trial, he was sentenced to death alongside of his prime minister, Viktor Pepelyev. On 6 February 1920, both men were allowed the prayers for the departing by the Russian Orthodox clergy and then were summarily shot. Their bodies were shoved under the ice in the Angara River, which had been broken up for the occasion. Neither body was ever recovered. Miklós Horthy was born the fourth of 8 children in June of 1868. His father, István Horthy, was an untitled noble and a member of the House of Magnates, the upper chamber of the Diet of Hungary. Horthy was raised a Protestant in the Kingdom of Hungary, where most were Catholic. At age 14, Horthy was enrolled in the Imperial and Royal Naval Academy at Fiume, now Rijeka, Croatia. The official language of the Austro-Hungarian military was the Austrian dialect of German. As a result, Horthy spoke his native Hungarian with a slight Austro-German accent the rest of his life. In 1896, Horthy was commissioned as a sub-lieutenant. He also served as a diplomat to the Ottoman Empire and traveled the world. He learned to speak Italian, Serbo-Croatian, English, and French, in addition to German and his native Hungarian. In 1901, he received his first command of the SMS Sperber. He was promoted to increasingly important ships until in August 1914, the outbreak of World War I, he received command of the SMS Habsburg, a pre-dreadnought battleship pictured here. By December of 1915, he would be reassigned to the light cruiser SMS Novara, which he would command during the Battle of the Straits of Otranto 2 years later. In that battle, Horthy was seriously wounded but continued to fight on until he fell unconscious. Although outnumbered by the combined British, French, and Italian fleet, the Austro-Hungarian forces were victorious, driving the Allied fleet out of the area and maintaining Austro-Hungarian dominance of the Adriatic. Horthy would maintain this command until the Cattaro Mutiny of February 1918. Emperor Karl IV, as he was known in Hungary, passed over more senior officers to the utterly loyal Horthy and appointed him commander of the fleet a few days later. The Prinz Eugen, not to be confused with the Kriegsmarine ship of the same name during World War II, became his flagship until the end of the war. In October 1918, just days before the end of the war, Horthy was promoted to his final naval rank, Vice Admiral. With the end of World War I and the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Emperor Karl IV ordered Horthy to surrender his fleet to the newly formed Kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes. Hungary lost more than 2/3 of its land territory to the above-named kingdom, also to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. These excisions were ratified by treaty in 1920, and Hungary was officially a landlocked country whose national identity had been dealt a very sharp blow. It was to this country that Horthy returned, thinking to simply retire to his family's 1,500-acre or 610-hectare estate. It was in this environment that Bela Kun and his partisan army declared the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Armed conflict to regain Hungary's lost territory was promised, but when that failed, armed gangs roamed the countryside, repressing citizens and unleashing terror similar to that taking place in the Soviet Union at the same time. Counter-revolutionary forces declared a competing government within weeks, and Horthy, still considered a national hero, was asked to be the war minister. Occupying Allied forces did not consent to Horthy having a cabinet post, so Horthy deftly moved to disconnect the army from the direct control of the war ministry. Soon Kun's government collapsed and the leaders fled. Horthy and the White forces entered Budapest in August of 1919, and a White Terror was unleashed on the supporters of the communist government. The reprisals lasted 2 years and targeted communists, social democrats, and Jews. While most Hungarian Jews did not support the communist government, Most of the top leadership were ethnic Jews, and this translated rather easily into a popular anti-Semitism. Horthy learned of a planned pogrom against the Jews of Budapest and ordered it stopped before it began. Whether or not Horthy supported the idea, he knew the pogrom would only give fuel to the Allied leadership, who was already against them just on principle. It is debated to this day whether or not Horthy tacitly supported the White Terror. Jews in Pest publicly absolved Horthy of any culpability in the reprisals in their city. However, Horthy had to stop his commanders several times, but he didn't remove them. The International Red Cross reported in 1920 that the National Army and the Civil Guard, which did the reprisals, were at least functionally separate entities, and Horthy had no responsibility for the latter. The debate rages on, and sometimes politics do indeed make for strange bedfellows, making opportunities to debate the subject both directions. In 1920, the National Assembly of Hungary, the successor to the Diet of Hungary under the Habsburgs, declared the Kingdom of Hungary. With no king to take the throne, the National Army under Horthy's control surrounded the building to protect it from undue Allied influence or domestic uprisings. Horthy and Count Albert Eponyi were considered for the position of regent. Horthy became the regent in a vote of 131-7 in his favor. After the vote, Catholic Bishop Ottokar Prohajka approached Horthy and asked him, "Hungary's parliament has elected you the Regent of Hungary. Would you please accept the office of Regent of Hungary?" To everyone's surprise, Horthy refused, unless the prerogatives of the monarchy were likewise given to him. In a compromise move, all the prerogatives of monarchy were granted, except the right to create nobles and the patronage of the Catholic Church, because, remember, Horthy was a Protestant. Now, Horthy was the king in everything but name, heritability of office, and the above-named prerogatives. He could do things like appoint and dismiss prime ministers and cabinet officers. When he took his oath of office, he was styled His Serene Highness, the Regent of Hungary. Serenity would not be a good word to describe the era he lived and ruled in. While Hungary was officially a kingdom, it had no king, and the Allies would not have tolerated any return of Emperor Karl IV, as he was styled in Hungary, to the throne of any part of his former empire. That didn't stop him from trying twice in 1921. Horthy successfully opposed him both times, and Karl IV died of respiratory failure on the Portuguese island of Madeira in 1922. Though opposed frequently, Horthy's opponents rarely mounted to more than token resistance to Horthy's rule, which focused on the stabilization of Hungary's political apparatus and the economy. István Bethlen, the prime minister, sought help in stabilizing the economy from the British. At first, it worked out well enough. Hungary's economy was growing. Their national idea was still hurting from the loss of nearly 70% of their former territory, but at least the situation on the ground was improving. That is, until the Great Depression hit and undid much of the work that Bethlen had advanced. Bethlen was removed, and Gyula Gumbush took his place as prime minister. In exchange for the office, Gumbush agreed to tone down his anti-Semitic rhetoric and to work with the Jewish business class. Nevertheless, Gumbush was a strong anti-Semite and a fascist sympathizer. Although Gumbush died in 1936, this shift to the right set the stage for the Hungarian alliance with Nazi Germany just 2 years later. Hungary in the 1930s was trapped between two major powers, both of whom were dangerous. To the east was the Soviet Union, and to the west was Nazi Germany. Horthy disliked both, but his intense hatred of communism led him to choose to navigate the tricky waters of an alliance with Germany to keep the Soviet Union at bay. His hatred of and frequent rants about communism led one American diplomat to discount it altogether as a phobia. After his experiences with the Hungarian Soviet government in the aftermath of World War I, it's not hard to imagine why he was so anti-communist. On the other hand, he was no friend of Adolf Hitler either. Germany shared a border with Hungary and was their major trading partner, but Horthy resisted efforts by Germany to pressure Hungary in regards to their Jewish citizens and military action later in World War II. One point of agreement between the two was that Czechoslovakia needed to be partitioned and that Hungary could regain the part of its territory ceded to the Czechoslovaks in the deal. In early November 1938, Horthy rode into the annexed territory on horseback at the head of his troops. Ethnic Hungarians in the reclaimed territory were ecstatic. Now Hungary was a German client state. In March 1939, Hungary annexed Carpathian Ruthenia from the newly formed Slovak state with Hitler's approval. In 1940, again with Hitler's help, Hungary annexed northern Transylvania from Romania in the Second Vienna Award Treaty. Hungary was regaining much of its lost territory with Germany's help. Still, Horthy was no Nazi, nor was he a fascist. He actually had Ferenc Szalasi, the fascist Arrow Cross party leader, arrested several times because he wanted no alien ideologies infecting Hungary despite his alliances with Germany and Italy. Due to those alliances, something had to give in regard to Hitler's demands. Laws not entirely dissimilar to Nuremberg laws were enacted between 1938 and 1941. In April 1941, Hungary became a de facto member of the Axis powers. Hitler allowed Horthy to send his troops across the Yugoslavian frontier to reclaim lost territory while Germany sent yet more troops to carve out a section for Germany to occupy. Then, in June 1941, the rubber hit the road, and the Hungarian troops joined in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The troops were only equipped for 4 days when the fighting began. 2 months later, the first deportation of Jews from Hungary took place. By 1942, Horthy was working to distance himself from Hitler. In September of that year, his son István Horthy, who was a fighter pilot, was killed in action. In January 1943, the 2nd Hungarian Division was wiped out by Soviet forces who were now on the offensive after the failed siege of Stalingrad. Seeing that the Allies were increasingly likely to win the war, Horthy worked hard at resisting the more egregious demands of Hitler. The loss of Stalingrad was blamed on the 800,000 Jews still living in Hungary. Hitler wanted them punished. Horthy allowed 10,000 of them to be deported to labor camps. Meanwhile, his government was seeking out secret negotiations with the Allies. By March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary and placed Adolf Eichmann in charge. Horthy began active efforts to resist Nazi demands, especially in regards to the Jews, and to make contacts with the Allies. By August of 1944, Horthy had deposed much of his own government and replaced it with members who were not Nazi sympathizers. He stopped all deportations of Jews, and then he did the unthinkable. After his experience with the Nazis, Horthy concluded that the Communists were, in fact, the lesser evil. His government signed an armistice with the Soviets, and Horthy announced it on the radio. The Nazis, anticipating this, swooped in and deposed Horthy, taking his son captive in the process. Nazis, with the help of the Arrow Cross Fascist Party, took control of the armed forces to prevent the surrender from taking place, even though the Soviets were already deep inside the country. Horthy was placed under house arrest in Bavaria until the 1st of May 1945, when he was liberated by Allied troops and then rearrested by the U.S. 7th Army. Horthy was taken to Nuremberg, where he was repeatedly interviewed for evidence in the trials of the war criminals there. He never testified in those trials, and he came to believe that the arrest was orchestrated to keep him out of Soviet hands. Josip Tito, the new communist ruler of Yugoslavia, wanted him charged with some crimes, and the Soviets would likely have handed him over. The new communist government of Hungary wanted to charge him with crimes too. Horthy was never indicted for any war crimes, and with the help of the former U.S. ambassador, John Montgomery, he was released from Nuremberg. He did testify in the Ministry's trial in 1948, which was the final round of the U.S.-led Nuremberg trials. Horthy would spend the remainder of his life in Portugal in exile. Wealthy Hungarians, including many Hungarian Jews, would financially support him and his family in exile. He never stopped being strongly anti-communist. He asked that his body not be returned to Hungary until the last Soviet troops had left Hungarian soil. When he died in 1957, he was buried in the British cemetery in Lisbon. In 1993, 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, his remains were returned to his native Hungary, where he was reinterred in his hometown of Kenderes. Okay, so we got a brief biography of two men from opposite sides of World War I. Both men were admirals when the war ended. Both men were heads of government. What makes their stories weird or unusual? It's precisely this. Both men were admirals who ruled governments that had no navy and whose lands had no ocean access. If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and hit that notification bell to be alerted to the latest videos from my channel. Until next time, my friends, this is Seraphim with Me, Myself, and I History signing off.